Well, we'll take a look at each of the individual major components that are part of Office 365. I'll start to talk about what's driving some of the deployments. Back in the Bay Area, we have a very large amount of clients that have made the move already to Office 365 or are currently moving off of on-premises into Office 365, so we'll talk about some of those driving factors and what is included as part of these different subscription packages. And then we'll talk about, at a high level, a bit about what the migration effort is involved with in moving to Office 365 for some of these various components. So really, what Microsoft Office, did with Office 365 is they took a lot of their very successful on-premises tools and then packaged them together into a large cloud offering. That's fundamentally what this is. This is a version of Microsoft's cloud. There's actually several different Microsoft clouds that are out there. You may be familiar with Microsoft Azure, or I've actually heard it from 5 different Microsoft peoples pronounced different ways. But that's an infrastructure as a service type of a cloud offering where you are given space to be able to build up servers, which is different than the software as a service type of offering that Office 365 is. So Office 365 provides different things around messaging with Exchange Online, collaboration, team sites, et cetera, with the SharePoint Online piece. But it also has other components as well too that are people may not necessarily be as familiar with. It's essentially meant to be a one-stop shop for different organizations to be able to go in and collaborate with their within their organization and outside of their organization as well, and use some of the tools that most people are familiar with. So the Office professional tools like Word and Excel and PowerPoint and those types of things. And as you'll see once we get into the licensing, Microsoft really pushes you out of the a la carte option where you may just buy one of these, and they really want you to be looking at just essentially buying into the whole suite of tools. So not only just one tool itself, but gaining access to all of the different tools that are part of that. So the way that Office 365 is administered is actually done through a web-based console. You also have access to PowerShell commandlets as well too. So as an administrator, one of the big changes is you no longer have a bunch of different MMC tools that are out there, one to manage Exchange, one to manage SharePoint. You're going in and doing different things when it's on premises. Within Office 365, what you're doing is you're basically opening up an admin center that gives you things like different service, the service availability within Office 365. So within the tenancy that I have set up here, that's just kind of a test one that I use for demonstration. I can quickly see the current health status of the various components that are part of my subscription. I can go in and create new users. I can delegate out things. I can do the types of things that prior to working within a cloud space I would have done within the various on-premises tools. And so the admin center itself is actually pretty functional. You can do all the types of things that you would have been able to do before, but within a cloud space. And if you're into the scripting aspect of it, they also provide for the PowerShell commandlets that will let you do things like mass create users, mass create mailboxes, go in and create different shared mailboxes, configure SharePoint sites. All of that can be done through the PowerShell commandlets or via the admin center itself too. So if you've never set it up or you've never played around with it, Microsoft actually lets you set up a 30-day trial, so you can just create a new tenancy. In fact, this one that I set up maybe took about 10 minutes to completely set up. It even went in and created all the DNS records within the, because I had a domain with GoDaddy, and Microsoft has a special relationship with them where they just went through, automatically created all the proper DNS records, set it up to work, and created mailboxes and created user accounts, and 10 minutes later I had a complete tenancy set up and ready to go. So it's pretty straightforward and easy to administer. One of the main, I guess Microsoft would refer to as kind of the gateway drug to Office 365 has traditionally been the messaging aspect of it. And a lot of that really is because messaging has become such of a commodity that people really don't want to have to maintain their own Exchange servers internally, and they just want to be able to store all those messages somewhere else, not have to worry about backups, not have to worry about cleaning out things out of people's mailboxes, et cetera. So one of the main driving forces, and especially in the early days of Office 365, was a need to get off of on-premises mail and move the administration of the mail component up into the cloud itself. So Exchange Online is that piece of it. It's really essentially a large distributed Exchange 2013 environment up at Microsoft that all your mailboxes get pushed up to. Now, of course, there's different data centers. Microsoft has data centers in Europe. They have different data centers in the US, data centers in Asia, et cetera. So wherever you set up, your tenancy, of course, ends up being where your actual databases are kept. But Microsoft uses the concept that they've built out over the years and that's baked into an exchange of the database availability groups, which is a concept where your mailbox actually exists in multiple locations at any one time. So it provides for high availability and disaster tolerance within the application itself. So all of the years of working on Exchange are part of Exchange Online. So all of that disaster tolerance, high availability, everything else are created within that space. You don't see that layer of it anymore. When I go in and take a look at my mailbox, I just see that I have a mailbox. But underneath the surface, Microsoft is replicating multiple copies of all those mailboxes to different locations. So that's, again, really one of the major driving forces is getting people's mail outside of these old servers within their organization and up into Microsoft where you can have these massive mailbox sizes. And that's another benefit that Microsoft provides is 50 gigabyte mailboxes for each user within Office 365. So it's something that's difficult to do internally, and over the years many people have kind of fought that challenge of clearing out space within mailboxes, but at the same time data retention becomes an issue. They get subpoenaed for different legal reasons and they don't have access to it, or everybody's storing things in PST and the lawyers are going after PST files and those types of things. So this helps you break away from that model of having to worry about all the data that's internal, and it moves it up into a single controlled space within the cloud itself. At the same time, Exchange Online provides for different features that go beyond just the standard feature set that you'd think of with Exchange. One of those features is a concept called site mailboxes, which is actually an integration tool between Exchange and SharePoint. Now, this is one thing that you could do on premises, but you would actually need both Exchange 2013 and SharePoint 2013 together on premises, and there's a fairly complex setup about it. It's something we cover within the book, but it requires certificate exchange between servers. It requires some complex setup, whereas site mailboxes is available right out of the box immediately within Office 365. And so a site mailbox is basically this kind of shared collaboration space that shows up as a mailbox within Exchange, but ultimately it's actually a site collection within SharePoint itself. And of course, since this is a SharePoint conference, a lot of what the interest may be is around SharePoint Online, which is probably, at least in our client base, the #2 driver of clients moving into Office 365. And a lot of it's around the same concepts. People want to get away from having to manage and maintain a distributed and highly available internal SharePoint environment, and they want to be able to move that stuff up and have it in a cloud type of environment. So the reasons for using SharePoint or SharePoint Online are the same reasons why you would use it internally. A lot of it's being driven by documents and records management, which is a key and core piece of SharePoint. It always has been. Ever since the initial releases of SharePoint. But at the same time, you're basically getting all of the functionality that's available within SharePoint on premises, actually, and then some. The version of SharePoint Online is actually one version ahead of the highest version that you can run in SharePoint on premises today. It's something that's interesting when you move into this cloud model, is that you're getting later versions of software that are even available with on-premises tools themselves. So you'll see different feature sets start to show up that don't necessarily make their way into the on-premises versions of these tools. And that's going to continue to go on to move forward as Microsoft changes and updates Office 365. But documents and records management, this is, again, the core piece of SharePoint, document check-in, check-out, versioning, multi-authoring, people working on documents, multiple people at the same time. That's a key piece of functionality that drives SharePoint Online adoptions. But other pieces that are part of this that a lot of organizations had trouble setting up, maybe because the infrastructure requirements were complex, or it took a lot of work to actually get it, to set up the servers to do this. Include things like the business intelligence features. These are some of the features that, when they start to get used, they become very valuable. You can take tools like Power Pivot, Excel services, Power View, all of those native integrated tools, and use them immediately within Office 365. So for example, this is just integrating in a database of information within SharePoint that shows medal counts, Olympic medal counts by country overlaid on a map. It becomes very easy to do that kind of customization with some of the business intelligence tools. And then, of course, the enterprise search functionality. It's surprising to me, well, maybe not so surprising today, but early on I would often get surprised how often search was broken within environments, within SharePoint locally at a client site. We'd go in and take a look at their SharePoint environment, and you try to search for something, it just wouldn't come back with any results because SharePoint was broken, and it was broken for many months. And people just got used to the fact that SharePoint didn't work properly in terms of searching. Well, that leads to data being recreated multiple times. That leads to a lot of problems. So a lot of the, the advantages to working within SharePoint Online is Microsoft has already set up the entire infrastructure around search, and you basically can go in and immediately start searching for all the content that goes into it. You have the ability to administer some of that, to change things. There's different, obviously, there's some search-specific sessions here that focus on it. But having that available is one of the key, key drivers of SharePoint Online. Particularly since, if you look at the history of where search is today, the search that's part of SharePoint Online today is actually the search that was part of this tool called Fast Search. And Fast was a Norwegian company that Microsoft bought up. That had this excellent search engine for SharePoint. So Microsoft bought them up back in the SharePoint 2010 time space, and then eventually that engine got integrated as the default search engine in SharePoint 2013, which is, of course, now part of SharePoint Online as well, too. So it gives you all that contextual search, personalized search results, a more enterprise search type functionality than you would get just out of a standard search engine. And then the way that Microsoft does, well, the way they do a lot of things within Office 365 and the way they do it specifically within SharePoint Online is they offer different a la carte plans as well as various all-encompassing Office 365 plans. So if you just needed SharePoint Online, you could just buy the a la carte plans. You could buy a basic SharePoint functionality plan, and I'll talk about how much that costs a little bit later on. Or you could start to basically take advantage of all the features within SharePoint Online and get the Plan 2 options. Most of our clients go into the buffet plan. They're getting everything. And you'll see why, again, when we take a look at the prices. Because once you add together even just SharePoint and Exchange, 2 a la carte plans are more expensive than just the all-encompassing plans themselves. So there are a few things, however, just because of the difference in the way that Microsoft segregates off their users. For example, you get your own space within SharePoint Online, and some of the challenges around moving to a cloud space, Microsoft had to essentially cut features out of what's available within on-premises. So we do have some clients that still use some on-premises components for specific things, performance points services, SQL reporting services, those types of things which aren't yet available as part of SharePoint Online. They may still have an on-premises component. And in fact, it's not to say that going to SharePoint Online means you move everything up into it. I actually probably still don't have a client that has everything completely within SharePoint Online that didn't start that way, let's say. A lot of times you get these hybrid scenarios where there's stuff that's stored locally, and then there's certain other sites that are stored in SharePoint Online. like the dynamic team sites would be stored in SharePoint Online versus certain records data might stay on premises. So it's very common to run into those type of situations where you have hybrid scenarios. Okay, one of the tools that actually has gone through a recent rename is what's now called Skype for Business. This is the old Lync tool. So what used to be called Lync is now called Skype for Business, and as of roughly 6 days ago, they've started moving everybody over that's part of Office 365 over to Skype for Business. So started automatically updating some of the components in the background. But what it is it's essentially the latest generation of a tool which was constantly updated over the years. Back in the, actually if you go way back, you remember Exchange Platinum, back in that day, that was the beta for Exchange 2000. It broke out what was going to be an included conferencing component and instant messaging component into its own tool, which became Exchange 2000 Conferencing Server. Later on, that started to evolve into what became Live Communication Server, changed the name again to Office Communication Server, and then later on Lync, and now finally Lync has been retired in favor of the Skype name. But Skype for Business fundamentally is this tool. It's not the Skype tool that we think about when we think about Skype in terms of the consumer grade model of the tool. Of course, there are integration points that are constantly being built into it as Skype for Business evolves, and they're starting to get closer and closer in certain things. But otherwise, don't be fooled by the name. Skype for Business is basically Lync version, or Live Communication Server version 8. It's a later on version of that same tool. In terms of feature set, just like with SharePoint Online, there are various differences between the types of plans that are offered. So you can actually go out and buy a Skype for Business plan if you just need some basic functionality and you need to be able to do instant messaging within people, you can get a plan 1. Or if you need to start to do some of the more complex things like video, multi-party type of big Brady Bunch conferences, multiple people involved, that's when you start to look for you're looking at Plan 2 options. And some organizations may still stick with the on-premises version of Lync, which again will be updated to Skype for Business as an on-premises tool as well too. Because there are still some gaps in terms of things like audio conferencing within the online offerings for Skype for Business. All right, OneDrive for Business. Can be some confusion over this just because there's some overlap within the consumer version of this, and also because it's gone through multiple name changes over the past couple of years. But if you recall, back in the day, Microsoft came out with SkyDrive. SkyDrive became OneDrive. Well, then they came out with a business version that's included within Office 365 of the OneDrive tool called OneDrive for Business. Effectively, this is Microsoft's Dropbox, if you're familiar with Dropbox, or their Box type application. This is a file sharing tool that can be used to very easily share files both internally and also externally. Now, as an administrator, you can define that you don't want people to share externally, but by default, that is turned on. When you set up OneDrive for Business, you can go upload a file, and then you can decide who it gets shared with within your organization, or you can create a link which allows it to be shared with people outside of the organization. Now, it was only a few years ago that one of the more popular sessions that I would do was in setting up SharePoint as an extranet, because that was a common request, is I want to be able to share files with clients, with partners, et cetera. Now, more and more, those types of extranet situations are being replaced with solutions like OneDrive for Business so that you can more easily set this up. Setting up SharePoint as an extranet would take weeks, and there's a lot of things to think about, and there was authentication problems and things like that. But OneDrive for Business makes it much easier to be able to share these files with both local or remote users. So again, you get the ability to just create a link and then send that out to a partner. Or if the partner is federated with you, or you're using different tools like Okta or Azure Active Directory that's shared with other organizations, you can actually specifically define a particular user that has access to it, or require them to go through kind of a registration process so that you at least know that the person that got the email is the only one that can access those documents. Within OneDrive for Business in the States, they changed from a maximum per user of 1 terabyte to unlimited. It was hard for me to validate whether or not you have that here. It looked like, based on the Office 365 UK site, that you're still limited to 1 terabyte here, but it's possible they're lifting those caps as well too in Europe. But essentially, they started with a relatively low cap. They went to 1 terabyte, which was a big deal, and then they basically removed the caps completely. So you essentially can store as much information per user within OneDrive for Business as you can possibly upload. Now, it doesn't mean you should just throw a bunch of junk up there as well. It's not necessarily the best location just to store everything that you've possibly ever had within your organization. But for specific documents, those types of things, OneDrive for Business can be a valuable part of it. And it's not a replacement for file sharing within SharePoint. It's just supplementing it with a very specific point solution for file sharing. By the way, they've changed the maximum file size. It used to be 2 gig. Recently, that's been updated to 10 gig as well, too. So they keep adding in more features and functionality within that particular tool. Microsoft recently also added in a license for Yammer Enterprise into Office 365 subscriptions. So Yammer itself was a tool that Microsoft bought. It was a company. They saw it. They had an enterprise social type of application. They then went out and decided they liked it. They bought the company, and they started to integrate it. And people were asking questions because there was a lot of overlap between the enterprise social features within SharePoint and Yammer. So over time, Microsoft started to basically replace some of the enterprise social features within SharePoint with equivalent type of Yammer functionality and encourage people to move to Yammer itself. So you have the option as an administrator within Office 365 to decide whether or not you're using the SharePoint social features or whether you're using the Yammer functionality that's part of it. But Yammer does get included, again, as part of that 10-minute setup within my Office 365 environment. I was given, just a standard Yammer site that just gets created automatically once I turn on the Yammer Enterprise feature within Office 365. So then gaining access to that becomes actually pretty easy to just, flip over and go directly into Yammer itself. But if you think of Yammer, a lot of people think of Yammer as kind of Facebook for the enterprise, and I guess you could think of it that way. It's got threaded conversation views. It's meant to be this collaboration space for people within your organization to be able to work with each other very easily and exchange ideas and concepts within kind of this enterprise social tool itself. So there's a lot of success stories that I've heard of. It's not necessarily for everybody. Some people shy away from enterprise social within their organization, but I've heard a lot of good arguments for why it can help to improve communications and collaborations within the organization. All right, so one of the things, I touched upon this a little bit earlier, but one of the interesting things about being within Office 365 is, unlike on-premises where if you need to set up a new feature, you need to install a new server, you need to install software, you need to configure it and go through all that. When you have access to Office 365, you start to, over time, get access to new features and functionalities automatically. Microsoft just starts adding them into it. It's like buying a car, and every once in a while they send you some kind of upgrade, a new engine, or a new seat or something. You just start to get new things automatically added into it. Now, this can make some people uncomfortable because if you're an organization that has to go through specific monolithic change controls for things, and you don't want that to happen, then maybe you don't necessarily move that, or at least that aspect of the organization, into the cloud, because you'll start to get new features and things turned on, and other things will even get deprecated in the background. One of those things that just got turned on one day was this concept called Delve. And what Microsoft Delve is this kind of almost like a mind mapping type of an application that shows you people within your organization, what they're working on, who they're working with, what type of information they've recently updated, different documents that they've done, and it goes across, the SharePoint and OneDrive environments that they're uploading this information to. So one of the things that they like to say is, like, for example, at Microsoft, Satya Nadella can look in at any employee within Microsoft and see specifically what they're working on. So you can just go into Delve and say, okay, this person's doing this, they're working on this project. So it gives you a lot of insight into what people within the organization are doing. And that's just one tool that, again, Microsoft just came out with. There's this other concept called Office Groups that's built into Office 365. And what Office Groups is, if you kind of think about it almost as a replacement for the distribution list. A distribution list is decades old. It's a concept that you send an email to the distribution group and it goes out to all the members. The downside over the years to distribution groups is that if you're working on a project, you create a distribution group for that project and people are getting all the emails for it. But then if you need to add a new project member, once they get added into that distribution group, they only get the emails from that point forward. They don't know anything about what happened before that. What an Office group is it's kind of like a distribution group on steroids. You're getting all this communications and they go into the specific area. So every email, every conversation is going into the specific group. And if you need to add someone into it after the fact, they have access to all the old communications. They have access to all the documents and everything associated with that particular group. So it's kind of an evolution of the distribution group concept itself. And again, this was another thing that was just added into Office 365 a few months ago. Microsoft introduces things like they just introduced Office Video, which is kind of a video library. It's this idea of these portals built on top of SharePoint that allow you to do specific type of point solutions. And this one is making it easier to search for videos within an organization itself. So that's something that's getting rolled out. Like in my tenancy, I don't have access to that one yet. It's slowly getting rolled out to users. And that's, another one, you may have heard some press on this. There's something called Clutter that Microsoft just rolled out to users within Office 365. It allows you to essentially have a more intelligent spam filter built into Office 365. So if you start to see items that come in, if it sees that you always get notification emails from a specific application and put them into a specific location or just delete them immediately, it starts to automatically do that for you, which can intimidate some people, which is why it isn't necessarily turned on by default. But again, that's another feature set that gets added into it. And fundamentally, what's really interesting to do if you haven't already done is look at the roadmap. Microsoft has their Office 365 roadmap listed. Go to roadmap.office.com, you can actually see, what type of features just got added into it. So you go through and you see, okay, there's, new support, LinkedIn, et cetera, Compliance Center in Office 365, different policies. You set up a compliance policy across the organization. These are the new launched features that have already gone out. These are the ones that are being rolled out. So, you've got the Clutter that's part of it. Office Graph, Delve, what I talked about, that's being rolled out. Some of the DLP, digital leak protection. It's fascinating sometimes to go through and see actually the types of new features that are actually in process, being rolled out, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this is all the new stuff. There's 43 new in development tools and applications and pieces of functionality that are going into Office 365 as part of the future. So it's interesting to take a look at that because that really keys into the way that Office 365 works and being part of this ecosystem that's dynamically updating all the time. Okay, licensing. There are a couple different versions and flavors of Office 365. There's actually a home version that's available. So this is outside of the business, and I'll just briefly talk about it, but just more of a comparison thing. You can actually buy Office 365 for your house. and actually have it sent out to, you put Office out on 5 different PCs or different Macs, 5 more tablets, et cetera, and you can have a home subscription for, £8 a month. There's a personal one, which is just for a single user. That's £6. Can I say quid, or do I have to say pounds? I don't know. People say quid. Anyway, and then essentially there are free versions of things like the Office Online, for example. Anybody can create a OneDrive account and get 15 gigs of free storage, for example. Those are the home plans. When you get to the business world, there are 2 different types of plans. There are the small business plans, which are for organizations of up to 300 users, and then there are the more enterprise plans. So the small business plans are priced differently, and they have different types of feature sets. One thing to note, there's no direct migration path from a small business plan up to the enterprise plan. So if you plan on growing or you're getting close to the 300 number, you probably would want to start with the enterprise plans. But essentially, they divide it into what's called Essentials, Business, and Business Premium, which you can kind of see in terms of the feature set. You get more and more features as you start to add on the different options that are available. Now, this next slide, I apologize if you're in the back because this is a little bit difficult to read. I encourage you to download the deck. But this one took a while to put together because you have to go through and piece. I had to piece through all the different plans that are out there and then what the feature sets differences are between them. I'm going to summarize this by saying, if you take a look at the way that they price some of these a la carte plans, like if you wanted everything that's in Exchange Online, you have to pay £5.25. Everything in SharePoint Online, the same. Add that up, that's $10.50. All of a sudden, you're more expensive than one of the E2 options that is part of getting everything or getting most of the things that are included within Office 365. The single most common license that we run into is the E3 option. It's partially because our client base is much larger than the 300 users. But E3 gives you almost everything that most people need within an organization. There are some differences. E4, one of the main differences is that E4 gives you the kind of like the centralized enterprise voice type functionality that differentiates it between it and E3. But E3, again, is a very common offering that we see out there. If you see a lot of what's included in the plan too is basically getting you access to Office itself. So having access to the full Office suite is only available with an E3, E4, or if you buy the a la carte plan. But that's over £10 just to get access to Office. So just by adding in another £4.60, you gain access, you have Office plus Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why Microsoft's really trying to push people into those kind of plans. Now, by the way, these are base rates. Depending on your organization and depending on the type of negotiation or the stage that you're at, I've seen a whole bunch of different changes in terms of it. Generally, it's lower than this. But this is a per user per month charge. So if you go by the base numbers that are out there, you're going to be paying £15 per user per month to gain access to Office 365. I've seen a lot of different math on justifying this. Math that includes things like savings on internal salaries. You don't need to have the people updating and maintaining Exchange and SharePoint. There's even just simple things like the energy requirements of running the servers, those types of things. The end result is that you may find that it's more expensive. You may find that it's less expensive. Depends on how you do the math. However, we are seeing a really large adoption, at least in the Bay Area, in terms of it just gaining access to that kind of cloud features and functionalities without having to maintain all that on-premises infrastructure. Okay, in terms of the migrations, there's a couple key things to think about when you're planning an Office 365 deployment. One of the first and most important is, where is your authentication coming from? In my tenancy that I set up, I'm just using the default authentication within Office 365, which is actually a version of what Microsoft calls Azure Active Directory. So it's basically a little Active Directory for us that Microsoft spun up for my organization that has 2 user accounts in it. I created one for me, I created one for my wife, I'm ready to go. So like I said, it's a little AD force that sits out there. The usernames and passwords, that's all stored up with Microsoft. It's not something that I set up. Now, most of my clients, though, want to be able to use their own internal accounts. They want to be able to create the ability to have the users log in their internal AD account and then have them automatically gain access to Office 365 using that account. So most of our clients will actually use the second option there, where they're actually using and creating that authentication framework and sharing that information with Microsoft. Now, as you can imagine, that's a bit more complex to set up. It requires either some ADFS infrastructure, although you can get around that nowadays, third party, or directly working with Azure Active Directory where you're creating a connection between your internal AD environment and Azure AD to be able to essentially have Microsoft trust your internal authentication credentials down here and pass those up into the application itself. Again, a bit more complex than I'm making it sound right now, but it's the preferred option for most organizations because they want to use that their internal AD accounts to authenticate against Office 365, and they don't want to have to keep maintaining separate sets of usernames and passwords, et cetera. Okay, this may look a bit complex, but in principle, a migration to Exchange Online is actually not too complex. The way that it works is very similar to if you just set up a brand new Exchange server within your Exchange org and you moved mailboxes over to it. So fundamentally, that's what you're doing, except that new mailbox server actually exists up in Microsoft. Within your organization, it looks like a server, you move mailboxes over to it, but you're just sending them up into Microsoft's cloud. How long it takes to do that actually depends on the speed of your link, how much data is going across of it. Microsoft actually has an Excel spreadsheet it's a bandwidth calculator for Office 365. It helps you to determine, how much bandwidth your users are going to be using and how much bandwidth you would need for the migration itself. Which, of course, is an important consideration to keep in mind. If you don't factor in the cost of increased bandwidth into your calculation is inaccurate because you generally need to increase the size of your links. You're not going now from Outlook to server internally. You're going from a whole bunch of different Outlook accounts up to Microsoft, and you need to calculate that in or factor it into the discussion. But basically, we're looking at a mailbox move. You're moving your mailbox. There's a DirSync server that's set up. There's authentication again if you're using internal AD accounts that you have to do. But you're just moving mailboxes up into that organization, the Microsoft side of it, and then retiring the old mailbox servers. So it's very similar to an Exchange migration. SharePoint Online is a bit more complex because as of today, if you're going to be migrating bulk data from an existing SharePoint on-premises environment up into SharePoint Online, you fundamentally need to use a third-party tool to be able to do that. So a lot of the large third-party companies, Metalogix, AvePoint, et cetera, they have migration tools that allow you to move the data from an on-premises environment up into Office 365. Now, there are some ways that it can be manually done from an end-user perspective, and we actually do have a lot of clients that just set up the SharePoint Online part as net new. So any net new projects go up there, whereas the old projects stay in the old SharePoint on-premises, or they might just move key documents up manually. So you don't necessarily have to do a third-party tool migration, but if you do have a large amount of files that need to be moved, you really need to be looking at the third-party space for that. If you do have Lync on-premises, migrating to Skype Online, or to Skype for Business, excuse me, is fairly straightforward. There's some PowerShell commandlets that Microsoft provides that's part of that process. It's generally done like we'll do it as a partner and help an organization to do that. But from that point on, its administration is done via the Office 365 admin console. Thank you so much, and appreciate your time.